Hi there. Welcome to my lecture today or webinar on applied methods to build power endurance. The nuance is where the magic is. My name is Coach Carmen Bott. I'm a performance coach and a university level lecturer. I'm also the author of The Wrestler's Edge, and I have trained 3 world medalists in freestyle wrestling as well as several professional football draft picks, taken UBC women's basketball to 2 national titles, lots of experience, 23 years, still learning. So I'm going to teach you some stuff that I've learned from some of my mentors, some of the methods that I use to build endurance or to condition combative athletes. So I would use some of these protocols for wrestlers, maybe MMA fighters, rugby athletes, really athletes that need to be able to express power against external resistance and do so sort of repeatedly over the course of a match or a game, and then maybe do that repeatedly throughout the day if there's several games or several matches. So if you want to get a hold of me, it's coachbot.com, and let's just get on with the show. All right, first of all, thank you for coming here today. You know, the fact you're investing in your continuing education speaks volumes. What I'm going to teach you is not exactly the most exciting information. It's not trendy. It's not new age. It's built upon a lot of principles that I've learned from Russian coaches, but have been very effective with clients I train. And I want to thank some of my clients. There are a couple girls there in the picture. We have an Olympian and a potential Olympian for both Team Canada, Team USA. I want to thank my family for their support and my absolute obsession with being good at what I do. And of course, my mentors. And one of my mentors I'm fortunate to mention is Pavel Tsatsouline. He does answer my direct emails, and we do collaborate quite often now. And I feel very, very privileged to have the opportunity to speak with him. He has taught me probably more than I can remember. And I also want to thank any coaches who have left a legacy in this field, whether they're still in it or have left the field, that have been influenced by a lot of people. So let's start with this triangle. I like this triangle. Tudor Bompa came up with it. This is how I teach my students at the university, how I teach them to analyze either sport or aspects of sport. And it really boils down to force, speed, and endurance. And, you know, how much force is required for that particular athlete in their sport or their position. How much speed do they need? How much endurance do they need? And it is really a matter of how much. And then, as you can see within those 3 points of the triangle, we have a lot of sort of subsets. And power endurance is, you know, falling up here on the top right, where we have higher forces and obviously an endurance aspect, but not so much a speed aspect. So the SE down at the bottom would be more your speed endurance or your high velocity movement, and I've done talks in that area as well. Today's talk is really exploring methodology to train power endurance in athletes. So first of all, we have to decide what's our goal here. What's the performance goal? We have fitness goals and performance goals, and to me, they're actually 2 different things. Fitness goals are typically kind of prerequisites an athlete would need to hit when they're developing. So let's say an athlete should be able to squat their body weight, I don't know, 5 times. Just I'm throwing this out there, or have a VO2 of 53 as a sort of a general fitness goal while they're developing. Once athletes hit, you know, sort of those milestones, if you will, and they've sort of evolved beyond the developing athlete, the adolescent athlete into the young adult, then we are looking at what is really going to impact performance and what's going to allow them to repeat complex motor actions over and over without undue fatigue that would interrupt their ability to express that force or maybe possibly run interference with their ability to execute the technical aspects of their sport. So I want to talk about the systems that are involved. My original background is in pedagogy. And then when I went to graduate school, I studied physiology. exercise physiology, and now I'm back in grad school studying psychology. So I like to think I'm a real jack of all trades, master of none, but this is really borrowed more from the physiology side of things, where we've got to appreciate that different systems are involved, right? We've got the central nervous system, the muscular system, the metabolic systems that all work together in functional synergy. And a lot of times people talk about, oh, I'm going to train this energy system. They are referring to a metabolic system. While that's all fine and good, and I think that helps us appreciate work and rest periods, which you'll see a lot of here, we can't neglect that we are also training other systems of the body at the same time, developing them at the same time. So the CNS, the goal is obviously to increase capacity to produce necessary intensity of neural impulses from the central nervous system to the muscles, and then decode the central motor program. So that way the body does elicit the movements we need to elicit, and does so with great efficiency. So keep that word in your back pocket. NM is really the neuromuscular system. So this is where we've got the muscular system just communicating with the CNS, where we've got this improvement of function of the muscles in tandem with any of the sport-specific work demands that athletes might face. And then metabolic, where we have energy, enhancement of the energy producing mechanisms and linking them bidirectionally. So meaning pathways going in either direction, not sort of isolating a pathway and thinking of it that way. All pathways are on all the time. It's a matter of dominance, and it's a matter of what pathway is most trained, and it is a matter of the individual. So the textbooks don't always give us all the answers really in that area. We have to watch the athlete. Okay, so if I were to give you any really kind of real world advice in analyzing the metabolic demands of a sport, you watch the athlete, because different athletes, like my top kids conserve energy better. They're more efficient, where my younger kids don't so much, not yet. Okay, so just something to consider. All right, so let's get our eye on the prize. What is the goal here? An increase in power is determined by the muscular capacity to produce force, and the greatest amount of mechanical energy per unit of time. So there's your textbook definition of power. We've got this idea of producing force and doing it really quickly. The endurance side of power endurance asks this quality of power, hey, you know what? You got to stand the test of time. So we are talking about two qualities that we are trying to develop, but intertwine together in an efficient, effective protocol or manner, so it actually translates to performance in sport. And success, it really stems from the ability to use repeated power efforts within a highly technical, tactical display of skill and strategy. So start thinking about the athletes that you're training. A lot of mine have to overcome large amount of resistance, like linemen, rugby athletes, even posts in basketball. Wrestlers can all benefit from this type of work that I'm going to explain in a little bit. So a muscle fiber's repeated power of contraction is also limited by its ability to use energy. Okay, so we need to make sure we're choosing methods that teach muscle fibers how to use energy, and how to use it by deforming those actual fibers and deforming the tendons. The myotendinous unit functions as one. So if we're doing, for example, long hold isometrics, we are probably not training that particular quality. We are probably quite often going in the opposite direction from that particular quality. And that's not a bad thing. I'm just saying that, if we want to teach the muscles to have powerful, repeatable contractions and to be able to deform and be very elastic, then we need to choose means. Means are exercises that, or drills that will actually produce this quality and not go the opposite direction. So we want to improve utilization of energy too, right? From that elastic deformation. So that's really key interest when we're trying to develop this repeated complex motor actions, if we're trying to develop power endurance in athletes. And if we can learn or teach the body to regain mechanical energy, it does reduce the use of metabolic energy. So this is where the idea of variety in training is really dangerous. I'm a little bit boring as a coach. I will often visit the same methods over and over, depending on what time of year we're in, with the same means. Now, means again are drills or exercises, because I want the athletes to be able to use their metabolic systems as efficiently as possible. And the only way to do that is to get really good at these exercises and get really good at the means. So let's look at sport. It does leave us some clues. Maximal expression of power in acyclical movement. So that's movement that's a bit chaotic and all over the map. It's not something that's repeated over and over again, like cycling or running. So maximal expression of power in that type of movement, whereby main components of competition activity have acyclical movement. So let's start thinking about, again, the sports where the athletes are moving acyclically. And that's pretty much all team sport, right? And a lot of position in team sport, court sports, combative sport athletes. This is not your form sports, which are your gymnasts, your divers, your synchronized swimmers. This is not your endurance athletes. So this talk isn't about those populations. So we need to really analyze the sport. And the Russians have always done such a good job of classifying sports. You can look that up too if you're interested. With wrestling, I've underlined something there because that's the sport I'm thinking of. The goal would be to improve an athlete's skill to display repeated powerful efforts and key movements. So with wrestling, some of the key movements are shots, different kinds of takedowns, and then reversals, which is sort of your shot defense and counterattack, if you will. So that's where my mind goes when I'm thinking about wrestling. But when you're listening to this webinar, you can start thinking about your sport. Like, how do your athletes express their power? What are they doing? How are they standing? Where are they moving? Generally speaking, okay, we're not going to mimic this sport exactly in the gym, of course not. But we have to decide, how is it that they're moving and what fundamental movement patterns do we need to be training? So we want to analyze those key movements. So let's look at wrestling, because like I said, it's my jam and I'm pretty into it, and you can use what you can take from here, you can use for your sport. So with respect to wrestling, there's a very variable regime of muscular work. So it's not like consistent, right? Like a Tour de France cyclist, if they're riding the flats, there's this constant power output, right? With a wrestler or a rugby player, it's variable. There's going to be sudden transitions from moderate to intense bursts of effort. So it's really important that we appreciate that. Another thing with wrestling that I loved when I did some reading by Verkhoshansky was that they classified as a long contact combative sport. So it's not the same as boxing. Boxing would be a short contact combative sport. I don't know where MMA falls. I think it's kind of like a mishmash of kind of everything, and we might actually have to analyze the athlete more than we do the sport when we're talking MMA. But MMA is not I have trained quite a few pros, but it's not really my wheelhouse or the sport that I sort of am gravitating towards. So let's compare wrestling again to boxing, or let's compare a lineman in gridiron football to a defensive back. Right? So the lineman's going to be engaging in long contacts, whereas the DB isn't. It's going to be short contacts. So we want to just appreciate that as well when we're analyzing different sports and positions. So with wrestling, they're required to maintain stability of technique in an ever-changing, unpredictable situation under fatigue, right? There's no such thing as an athlete not being tired. I remember having an athlete tell me that she didn't think she did very well on a fitness test. And I said, well, how did you expect to do? And she said, well, I thought I would do better. I was really tired toward the end. And that's kind of how I feel in a hard match. I feel really tired. And I said, well, we're never ever going to avoid that. So that's an important message for the athletes out there when coaches are talking to them. You're not going to say, okay, I'm going to train you so well, you're never going to feel tired. But if you start to see technique and mental fortitude stabilize under fatigue, then we have a win. Then we have performance, right? So we're not trying to avoid fatigue in a competitive situation. That's impossible when you're working hard, but we want to build the engine so big that we don't, end up in an acidic mess so that we can't even concentrate. So just something to think about. Another thing to think about is that if you go in the literature and you search power endurance, you're going to see all kinds of literature in the endurance sport. So keep in mind that those are models of power, right? And they do, time to fatigue. I do a lot for my students at the university where we calculate critical velocity or critical power using different time trials. But these time trials are done with cyclical repeated activity like running or cycling, and we can graph it. It's easy. It's easy to model that power output. It's easy to then say, okay, if you're over this pace or this wattage, you are then above your LT2 for the physiologist in the room. But for the combative athlete or the collision sport athlete or the basketball player, this doesn't fit. Okay, so let's throw that out the window. We need to worry about any of that stuff, which might make you happy. I know it certainly makes me happy. So models of power capture ergometers, right? And they look at this idea of an exponential decrease in power. So my students all graph this and I mark it, and it's super exciting, but it's not what we do in majority of sport, okay? And we don't typically do a series of endurance tests. So I'm going to move on. You can take a screenshot of this slide if you need to, but I'm going to move on to what we really want to get into today. Before we start with protocols, I want to tell you that if you do too much volume, it doesn't work. Okay, so things like high volume endurance protocols, even if they're well below threshold, like if I made one of my wrestlers go for a run for an hour, like run 6 miles, 10 kilometers, I'm going to negatively influence her power development. The girls that I train are extremely powerful and very mesomorphic, so they're heavy. Running for an hour is exhausting. Same thing if I put them on a hypertrophy program or some of the nonsense that I see on functional hypertrophy. I don't even know what that means, but that's all going to run interference. Look, if people get jacked and big from training, it's pretty much genetic. So if you choose as a coach to put someone on a hypertrophy plan, you just got to know that that's going to run interference to power and speed development. Period. The end. You can't have both. You can do it for a block and then come over here, come join me, go for it. That's fine. But don't try to do the two at the same time, because you're just going to end up putting two types of flour in your recipe and it's not going to turn out. Okay. Changing electrical properties of muscle is a negative influence if you're doing too much volume. Changing in the pH, which I didn't mention, but you can see it there. Neural fatigue, central nervous system fatigue, which we all hear about, but nobody seems to explain quite in depth. But, basically we have things like neurotransmitter depletion, and then of course you can't get signaling to the tissue, and then you're not recruiting as many fibers. I mean, it's fairly easy science. Impairments due to inefficient use of the stress shortening cycle. You got to be able to use that well and over again. And if you do a lot of volume work or you do a lot of isometrics, you're going to impair that. I can promise you. Okay, it's definite. Like, you add that to the recipe and you're adding vodka to your cake. All right, reduction of electrical innervation and use of stored muscle energy. That just sort of explains a little bit more in depth on exactly what's happening mechanistically to the stretch shortening cycle. I know, exciting, right? So this dampening effect of this stretch shortening cycle also leads to an acute increase in muscle stiffness. It's fine to have tendons that are stiff, but we get really stiff muscles, then we can't produce good contractions. We talked about this earlier. We talked about this idea of elastic deformation. We want that. Okay, we want muscle tissue that's very pliable, very elastic, and very responsive. So if you're following high training volume programs, you're gonna negate that. Like, just ask any marathon runner to jump. Okay, or maybe don't. Anyway, if you do, you'll see what I mean. Okay, so training process. Increase the force generating capacity of the muscles and optimize reciprocal relationships is part of our goal here. So if generally speaking, the higher the quantity of mechanical energy a muscle can express, then we have a higher total that will be available to the athlete during competition. So what this whole page means is that if an athlete isn't strong, okay, and I'm going to use this word very lightly, they will not benefit as much from power endurance training or methodology. Now this, I'll circle back. What do I mean by strong? Okay, you're going to have all kinds of powerlifting types telling you that you need to squat 2 to 3 times your body weight before you can do a squat jump or a plyometric. Okay, you're going to have people say that, you know, we can always get stronger. Strength is important. It's the most important quality. Now, I learned from my coaches that, yeah, strong first is the name of Pavel's company now, which is brilliant. But I think Pavel would agree, and I don't want to speak for him, but it's strong first, and then, yeah, you're good. Okay, so sometimes, and we can preserve max strength pretty nicely without doing a lot of volume. That's sort of a beautiful thing. But there does come a point when you don't need to be stronger. And I'll be honest, it depends on the client. I have one athlete and she is strong. Holy moly, man. In the weight room, she can blow away majority of the competition like a weightlifter. And she can execute the power endurance methods very well. I have another athlete that's not as strong pound for pound and is equally competent on the methods. When I say competent, I mean they hold their shape on every rep with load. Okay, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. So that's up to you, coaches. You got to decide if your athlete's strong enough for this stuff. But that's the first step, okay? We also need to know that power is not simply dependent on strength. So when I gave this talk at the Australian Strength and Conditioning Conference, I had a few people that gave me a one eyebrow up going, what do you mean it's not simply dependent on strength? Well, it's not. Okay, I can give you a ton of evidence to support that it's also dependent on the ability to ration mechanical energy. You know, even people that are Olympic weightlifters and do power cleans, you know, every day of the week would agree with me here that their power clean could go up without their back squat going up per se. Okay, now if you're more of a novice lifter or an intermediate, sure, then you need to get your strength up. But if you're at an elite level, then we're refining technique, right? So let's just kind of keep that in mind. And then training methodology of specific exercises can be created, and that's used to improve active and reactive explosive force production. So we start with, you know, max strength work. Make sure that the athlete is strong. I'm not saying you can't do this stuff if your athlete doesn't lift, but you might want to pick some of the body weight methods to begin with, and then the loaded methods reserved for people with a higher strength background. That would be my disclaimer advice. Then we need to identify key movements. And I tend to go, all right, rugby players, basketball players, wrestlers, they all need efforts off the ground. Okay. Wrestlers need to be able to wrestle from their knees too. So that's a different beast. But from the knees, from the toes, from the feet. Think of an O lineman, it's from the feet. And then displacement of the body. So that's movement, you know, of the body and the limbs, and some kind of level change, like up and down. Okay, so they're moving in kind of a small space and pushing away the ground in a lot of these sports. And you'll see this is kind of common amongst most sports. So when we select exercises, which are the means, we need to think about what these athletes need to be able to do. And this is the principle of dynamic correspondence. Okay, so if I want to build power endurance in a wrestler and they need to be able to repeatedly drop, level change and shoot, then I'm probably not worried about building power endurance using a jerk, a kettlebell jerk, like a repetitive kettlebell jerk. I would use something for the lower body, something for the hips. So this is where I want you guys to be thinking, okay, about this you're preparing athletes for. Then you got to plan, right? We got to decide how prepared is this athlete to do what you want them to do? What prerequisites do they own? Then you want to pick your means before your methods. So what they own will dictate what they can do. Their exercise IQ. Their exercise IQ is going to dictate the method you choose. I can't tell you how many coaches don't follow this rule, and I'm going to call it the bot rule because I don't even know where I learned this. I learned it from someone else for sure because I'm not really that clever, but if you choose a method, then you're stuck. Then you have to use a barbell or you have to use a kettlebell. But if you choose a means, then the method can evolve from that, okay? And match that means to the athlete's competencies. Then you have to determine what's the goal of the training method that you are going to use. Where are you at in your competition schedule? I'll give you guys some rules in a bit. And then be aware of like logistical factors, temporal factors, time factors. Do they have enough time to do this session? Do they have the proper floor? Or the only place they can jump on is cement? Is that ideal? Okay. Be aware of the interference effect. What is going to interfere with power endurance? I've already told you high volume. So hypertrophy methods and endurance, where we've got long distance, high volume endurance. And that will look different for everyone. Okay, a heavy lineman running for 30 minutes continuously would be like death. But if you asked a cross-country runner to run for 30 minutes, they'd probably do it eating a sandwich. So it really depends on the stresses that would be on that person, like in terms of what is high volume. So high volume has got to be compared to what they're normally doing. And then always the last thing you do is then you determine or you define the total work volume for each training cycle. And I tend to like to use 4-week cycles. All right, so phase 1 is our foundation. This is where we would increase the potential for strength endurance at anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity. So I might put an athlete on, this is GPP, so I might have put an athlete on like a strength endurance protocol before I'd put them on a power endurance protocol, just to get their body ready for, and you know what? Gosh, you're doing sets of 8 on a back squat. To me, that's strength endurance. You know, if your rest periods are a bit shorter and your load isn't that heavy, like if you're working around 60%, right? That's strength endurance. That's not strength training. If you're lifting lighter than 80%, you are not strength training. You're strength endurance training. So keep that in mind and how that's defined. It's not doing a body weight circuit. There's really no room in a high performance athlete's routine for like a body weight circuit, unless it's done kind of at the end as a means to just build some local muscular endurance. Okay, so we wouldn't use jumps during this time. And why do we do it? Well, it helps enhance muscles' oxidative qualities, and that's never a bad thing when we have more oxidative muscle. And then the second goal for your GPP is to get the person stronger, so get their max strength up. Okay, and what I tend to do after I've done like maybe one block of max strength, I might do another one where I have everything they're doing is done in singles, like squat the weight. It's a 2 RM, but in between each rep, so you do 1 rep, shake your legs out for 2 seconds, do another rep. We can talk about that another time, but I find it really effective in preserving some of the elastic quality in tissue. Okay. Then we've got peaking. So we could call it phase 2, we call it peaking, we could call it, the power endurance phase, whatever you want. So if you choose to use kind of more this block style of periodization or planning, you can keep some max strength. Okay, so still do maybe once a week of max strength. You don't want to lose that completely. But now you can start doing more explosive strength and power endurance methods. So this is where you might be doing like double kettlebell cleans or barbell cleans, snatches. That's your explosive strength. And then the power endurance methods that I'm going to be teaching you today. So really we're trying to foster a bit more coordination, right? And maintain that for a little bit longer periods of time. And that's going to allow us to, execute our sport movements on a nice foundation of power endurance. It's a foundation, right? We're not mimicking the sport movements. All right, you guys ready to move into some means and methods? I hope so, because this is the nut and bolts of how do we do this stuff. Okay, so give you some coaching insights. First of all, warm up like crazy. 20 minutes minimum. Get that body temperature up. If you need to, take your temperature with a thermometer. Okay, I know I'm a bit weird, but if you're cold or an athlete's cold, the stuff doesn't work and there are more chances of getting hurt. So how do I warm my kids up? I have them do continuous calisthenics as their warm up. But keep in mind what a wrestler does in a normal warm up, the average human being would die of. It's pretty vigorous. They're just used to it. So if you have a lazy team sport athlete that just hasn't been coached very well on warm up, you don't want to cook them in the warm up. So you're going to have to use your eyes and your observation. Training dosage is not set in stone. So what I'm going to teach you is totally malleable. You can change it. You can, change it based on the quality of the work the person's doing, be confident to deviate. Okay, you're the coach, make the right decision at the right time. Select methods based on the level of preparedness of the athlete, as I mentioned, and don't use these methods when the athlete is tired or sore. I often get, coaches or other people saying, well, that's kind of impossible. Athletes are always tired. I mean, it's relative. Okay, it's relative. You got to know your athlete, right? So just know thy athlete, and then you'll know if they're actually really tired or just a little bit tired. And keep in mind that what I'm going to teach you next is done in combination. It's part of an entire program. Okay, so it's not like, oh, I'm going to just do this now, and that's it. It's not a standalone program, even though I am going to give you an ebook with some programming that I'm going to teach you in it. It's not to be done just all on its own. Okay, it's done part of a comprehensive plan. Okay. Create some conditions of the training to force intensification of the work. What does that mean? You got to get psyched for this stuff. You got to get very aroused. You've got to get your athletes into the right mindset. I'm not a yeller. I don't scream at people. I talk to people. I ask them, like, what is it that you need to visualize to get yourself into the right state of mind? And we go from there. So that's what the coach must do. If we can excite the central nervous system, then we will have better performance. Okay, so we all have these innate mechanisms that allow for extraordinary feats, but they must be tapped into. They must be tapped into. And this really is where coaching and accountability comes in. It's hard to tap into these things when your athlete is working out alone. Okay, so having supervision isn't always about correcting form and technique. I don't correct form and technique as much as I used to with kids I train because they're very competent, but a lot of it is just about the nuance, right? Making sure that they are fully ready and engaged and ready to go. Okay, they're in that right frame of mind. Okay, let's look at the exercises. So what are we going to do? What are we going to pick? Well, that depends on the character of the force efforts of the sport. You can use lots of different exercises to tackle different aspects of dynamic correspondence as well. So you can mix up exercises. That's a totally okay thing to do. I would stick with an exercise for a particular method for a block of time. Otherwise, athletes might get really sore, but you can definitely vary your means. So another thing to consider is we want to use drills in a progressive manner or means exercises in a progressive manner. This is actually truly conjugate. Conjugate system that evolved from Russia wasn't the way that I've seen conjugate done in more modern American programming, North American programming. I'm actually not going to throw Canada under the bus. I haven't really met too many coaches in Canada that subscribe to that, but lots in the US where they use conjugate methodology. It's not bad. I just think that the way I learned it from Russian coaches is just different in that the drills for each phase evolve into more complex drills. Okay, so that's what conjugate initially was in Russia. And we can do another lecture on that if you're interested in the history. But that's how I understand it. Okay, so you can use lots of different types of jumps, but as long as they kind of build one onto the other. Program in relaxation drills in your workout. So when I tell you you need to shake the limbs, which I will, you want to make sure that that's programmed in for your athletes. And that checklist there is all the benefits you're going to get. There's my sales pitch, I guess, from the methods that I am going to show you. So we have a couple categories, jumps with body weight, jumps with external resistance, and then depth jumps. Those are a hierarchy of complexity and difficulty. What I would recommend is that you probably start with the jumps without overload, which is on the left, but with a novice or an intermediate before you would overload them. Okay, it kind of makes sense. If they haven't hit the requirements of strength for their sport, then don't start them, don't overload them and stick a barbell on their back and ask them to jump. Kind of common sense, but I'll reiterate. We're not going to use depth jumps at all as a power endurance method. That would be insane, but they're on the chart just to give you guys an idea of how the conjugate system uses jump exercises and how they evolve from jumps over objects to bounding to stair jumping all the way to loaded jumps and then to off box and then onto another box. It wouldn't just be off a box. So on to the next. Okay. All right. We also have some different types of doing our methods. So I'm going to put these all up and then I'll talk about them. Okay. I don't know if you've heard these terms before. They're not super prevalent in prescription and a lot of things I see in North America, but I love them. I think they're great. You can use one of the three, and I'll give you recommendations on the methods as to which ones tend to work better. But the repeat method is when we rest between sets, and it seems to be enough duration. So like if you did 3 sets of 5 back squats in the gym and you rested 5 minutes, you would probably hit your numbers on each set. I mean, given you're not going to fail, you're not testing each set, right? You'd hit your numbers, you'd hit your 5 reps at the load that was prescribed. And let's say there was just straight sets, no change in load. That's a repeat method. Okay. An interval method would be more like insufficient rest. So like it gave you 2 or 3 minutes of rest instead of 5. And that's where we would build some strength endurance. Okay, but you also want to keep in mind that the efforts on intervals are never maximal. Okay, so that's a really key differentiating point. Like if you're using the interval method, that's great, but just know that that person is never going to be able to give their absolute max. So their arousal levels don't need to be so high, whereas the repeat, you want them to go as hard as they can for that particular set. Now, the serial method is different. The serial method is where we group a bunch of sets together. So let's say we did 4 sets of 6 in the example, and then we rest. But between each of those 4 sets of 6, there's still rest there as well. So let's go first set of 6, rest 4 minutes. Second set of 6, rest 4 minutes. Third set, rest 4 minutes. Fourth set, rest 4 minutes. Then you finished your first grouping of 3. Okay, then you're going to go out for a run for 8 minutes. You're going to come back in, do it again. The whole thing I just said, go out for a run for 8 minutes, come back, do it again. That'd be the third round. So that's what that multiplied by 3 is. You can write it out however you want. That's how I write it in my prescription. I understand it. My kids do, but you need to be able to explain it because it's not overly intuitive. Okay, and keep in mind that the methods that above are when we execute reps back to back. Okay, they're executed continuously versus doing a rep, relaxing your limbs, doing a rep, relaxing limbs. Okay, so it's continuous contractions. Just to keep that center. All right, you ready to look at some methods? Multiple jumps in place is method number 1. You can use either the repeat method or the interval method. You are going to have to choose what you want to get out of it. 5 different vertical jump exercises. So off 2 legs. So this is where you get to be creative as a coach. Pick 5 that the athlete knows how to do. And those 5 are called variants, Russian terms. Again, you call it an exercise or a jump. You repeat that jump 10 times. Okay. Then it says to rest 1.5 minutes, but there's an asterisk. It's starred because, well, it's adjustable. You can move it down, you can move it up. Okay, it's going to depend if you're doing the repeat or the interval method. Theoretically, if you did 10 jumps, it takes about 10 seconds. If you multiply that by 12, you get 120. That's 2 minutes. So repeat method, you're probably resting closer to 2 minutes, maybe longer. Interval method, you might be resting 60 seconds to 90. Okay, keep that in mind. You're going to repeat that for 10 minutes straight. Okay, so 10 times. 10 jumps, rest, and then 10 minutes. You're going to observe repeatability, shape, ground contact time. Let's say your athlete gets to 5 minutes and they're all over the place. You keep going? No, you're going to call it a day. Write it down. They did 5 minutes today. Do it again next week. See what changes, see how they adapt. Now you can certainly change the exercises, but I'd keep them on the same ones for at least 4 weeks. Okay, box jumps. This is where you actually take a really small box. It's like 30 to 40 centimeters high, and you just jump back and forth off of it. Now, I apologize, there's no video on this, but I've provided a PDF that has live links to all of these protocols. Okay, so you can watch video on all of these to get a better idea. I know myself, I can look at this, and if I can't see it, it doesn't make any sense. So I feel ya. So we've got this box. You're gonna jump on it and off of it. Be relaxed, but you're not like jumping in the sense of really bending your knees. It's just pop, 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 pop. Almost like when a basketball player does that drill just underneath the backboard and they pop up off the ground over and over like an ankle hop. Think about kind of an ankle hop, but you're on and off a box. Okay. Be really consistent on landings. And the goal is to work up to 40 to 50 reps per set. 4 sets, resting 3 to 4 minutes. Okay, so let's think about these basketball and volleyball players that jump how many times per game? And how many coaches out there are doing this as their preparation in the off season to prepare them? And then how many athletes have shin splints by week 4, week 3? A lot of these injuries that athletes are facing are basically due to lack of preparedness, right? So if we can inoculate them by doing some volume and doing it sensibly with a really basic drill, they barely need any equipment to do, then we've got a recipe for success. So this is the serial repeat method. The athlete does say 40 jumps. They rest 3 to 4 minutes. You get to decide as the coach. They do another set, they rest, another set, rest, another set, and then they do some recovery from 10 to 12 minutes. And you can choose. You could do like a mobility circuit. You could put them on the bike, send them out for a walk. I wouldn't run on top of that. I would keep it low impact, 10 to 12 minutes, and then repeat. Okay, let's look at some methods with some overload. So we've got barbell half squat jumps. So these are not full squat jumps. This is done with a barbell, so an athlete does need to be really strong through their trunk, okay? And a young athlete. You're not going to give this to, a master's level athlete because their spines are just not the same as a young person, and you want obviously no history of back problems, right? So you can do a parallel jumps, or you could do scissor jumps. In the video, it's a squat position, so it's up to you. You're basically jumping with weight on your back. Okay, there's no pausing. Now, you're probably wondering, well, how much weight? It depends on your athlete's abilities. It's actually the general recommendations are 30 to 60% of 1 RM, but then you have to add the athlete's mass back on top of that. Okay, so if 30% of someone's 1 RM is 100 pounds and they weigh, 135 pounds, that's going to be 235 pounds, for example. Okay, so just keep this in mind and play with it. If you think that's just way too heavy, I'm going to show you another protocol on the next slide that might be more benign. And you really have to gauge who you're prescribing this for. And again, it's the serial repeat methods. You can see the prescription there. I don't need to read off the slide. Here we have consecutive kettlebell squat jumps. I actually really love these. Kettlebells held with 2 hands between the legs. You can stand on elevated boxes if you want more amplitude, or you can just stand on the ground and then hit the kettlebell off the ground on each rep, but don't bang it, just kiss it off the ground. And the athlete has to hold shape, so it's really important that they don't start rounding through the upper back because of the way they're holding that kettlebell, extending all the joints, shaking fast and loose between sets. So that's just shaking the arms and the legs, and then jogging between the series, if there are series, which there are. So we've got 2 protocols. If your goal is more max anaerobic power, you can see the volume of jumps is lower. But if the goal is more to increase local muscular power endurance, then you can go more jumps. There's a couple different protocols you guys can play with to improve either power or to improve endurance. And as you can see, it is the repeat serial method as well. And I'm a big fan of this method because you can get such high quality work done with a decent amount of volume. If you imagine doing 4 sets of 5, okay, but not doing that in series, doing that like so it's 3 series. That would actually be 12 sets of 5. You can imagine if you're only resting 30 seconds, what that form and technique is going to look like, right? So if you put in these micro rests, this 68-minute rest where the creatine phosphate can actually fully resynthesize, we can add some oxygen back to the equation to flush out, clear out, and recycle some of the lactate, then we've got a more functioning, a highly functioning muscle tissue to be able to produce force and become athletic. So I'm not a big fan of the burn. So I always ask my athletes, do you feel a pump? Do you feel a burn? And if they do, then we back off on the volume. All right, let's finish up here. So some coaching insights, you guys, on the rest intervals. Respect it. Respect the time. Respect the type. Active recovery is key. So I did a big paper a couple of years ago for a presentation I gave in Poland on speed endurance, and most of my research was on the resynthesis of phosphocreatine. I know, super interesting, right? Not at all. But if you're interested, there's lots of anecdotal stuff out there to say this is how long you guys need to rest, but it really boiled down to what people were doing for their rest, and if they were actively recovering, they actually resynthesize the phosphocreatine faster and more fully. So move, okay? Let the heart pump blood around, but not at a high level. Like keep the heart rate around 120 during the recovery interval. Allow the parasympathetic system to work with the sympathetic system. Our North American culture is to go, go, go as hard as we can during the workout and then rest. Why can't we intertwine that during the workout? Why wouldn't we do that? We'd want an athlete to do that in a competition. If my athlete goes off the mat, in between, say that she's got 2 matches back to back and only an hour of recovery, she's going to figure out how to bring her nervous system back down and then bring it back up again. If she stays elevated the whole time, she's going to be very fatigued and ripping through a lot of glucose. So ignoring adequate correct methods of rest will move the training effect toward hypertrophy. So if you don't rest enough, you're going to improve your muscle endurance and get bigger, and I promise you will get slower. Between maximal efforts, sets and series, and full range of motion leg swinging exercises should be performed, and that's just to preserve that elasticity. And submaximal work could also be performed to facilitate lactate shuttling. So if you did do a nice easy jog, like you'll see in one of the videos, it does help with lactate shuttling, but the athlete needs to be fit enough to jog, and if they can't, then have them walk. That's fine. So here are my works cited for this particular talk. As you can see, I definitely spent a lot of time reading Verkhoshansky's works. I've tweaked some of the protocols a little bit in my presentation just based on things that I've done as a coach. I would love to know how you're implementing this information. And I really appreciate you listening to me talk about this today. I know it's not the most exciting topic, but the more we understand, I think the interference effect, the better our athletes will be. And I know that that's still a small number of us, and I usually only attract the really nerdy people. So if you can boil this down into coach talk and educate sport coaches, I think it would do the industry a big favor. Thank you very much and have a great day.